Shit. I don't know why I get so bent out of shape trying to start these damn streams when I know nobody's gonna listen. But whatever. I need to talk. And I don't know. I think I can ramble about a lot of stuff. I haven't really read this yet. But Frank Elavsky, I really look forward to whenever they put out some material. It's usually just so well written and thoughtful. But yeah, there's a new post. We'll get to it. But just to like kind of understand where we're coming from here, maybe it's worth just introducing Frank a little bit.
Voiceover on OBS Studio.
So here's Frank's
Visited
website.
link.
This
Frank
is
menu bar.
frank.computer.
You are currently on a visited link. Publications.
And then I want to do
Visited link. Frank Elavsky link. Projects. Visited link. Visited link. Visited link. End of nav. End of main. You are currently on a main inside
Let's
of
see, we'll get
OBS. OBS Studio 31.0.2. Profile.
it up.
Untitled. Visited
There's
link.
Frank.
Visited
Whatever.
link. GitHub. Heading level 1. Hi, I'm Frank Elavsky. I research, design, engineer, contribute to standards, and talk about things at the intersection of data work and accessibility. I consider myself a maker and a builder before anything else, but I like to think I also do this work critically. I'm a PhD student and researcher at the link Human-Computer Interaction Institute at link Carnegie Mellon University. Full stop. I am advised by link Dominic Moritz and link Patrick Carrington, and a member of the link Data Interaction Group and link Axel Lab. Full stop. I also offer part-time consulting services on a case-by-case basis, from single session calls to large, ongoing projects. My more recent work, both big and small, includes collaboration with the wonderful folks at link Highsofts High Charts, Bar Chart, link Apple, link Adobe, link Fizz Studio, link SRI, link UW-Madison's WGNHS, link Northwestern University's MLDS, link Quantside Labs, link 538, link Draw, and link Microsoft. Full stop. As of Jan. 2024, I am likely booked for larger projects until the end of the summer of 2026. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I would still be happy to discuss what you're up to, connect you to folks, and send over resources. It's me, a white man smiling with medium short brown hair, glasses, and a gray t-shirt. Image. List 2 items. Link. FJE.
So that's Frank. Wonderful human being. But let's dig into his writing a little bit.
Voiceover off.
This is so much easier than like me reading this. It's almost, I'm finding I'm not quite there on my thoughts yet. But there's something about this is some of the things using a screen reader as a surrogate voice that's sort of assistive here. So this was the article that came out, and I've actually been thinking a lot about this concept. So like, I do calligraphy. I actually do, use dip inks here. And I keep thinking about this sort of relationship between data visualization and art. I think like a lot of folks see data visualization as visual art because it almost seems like computers were made for it. But there was like a time when like data was reasonably sized. You didn't actually need the computer to do things. There's actually a artist, and I don't want to get ink on all this, so this is some sloppy ink. I got this really excellent calligraphy pen at a, I don't know, antique store or something like that. But it's got this interesting little set in there in the middle. Probably need to find a way to do better macro shots here, but it helps hold ink. Like usually Um, let's see here. I do not have. I do. I know. I know it's nearby, but I'm going to make a huge mess if I keep working with this. But like from the ink perspective, when you're drawing with ink, the like amount of ink that you can hold per dip almost limits what you're able to say sort of per stroke. So I understand this concept of ink sort of personally. And yeah, it is all data ink at the end of the day. But when we look at this book, it's a collection by Elizabeth Otto and Patrick Rousseler. It's about women at the Bauhaus. There's so many amazing folks in here, but like specifically relevant to this conversation, we're gonna find it. I just like generally know where it is. I have a very peculiar internal indexing system that helps me find this stuff, but it also doesn't really hurt to. Here it is. This is great. This is Margaret Leiteritz. She was a teacher at the Bauhaus, but she's actually known specifically for 39 scientific diagrams. Their abstract structures transformed into colorful canvases of a compelling clarity, comprise the magnum opus of Margaret Leiteritz, a soft-spoken graduate from the Dessau years. So that's early Bauhaus, where a lot of the early feminine influence came from. So this is a diagram in the top left that it actually is attributed to Margaret. So maybe she created it herself, which is even more delightful, isn't it? But then she goes and does a beautiful painting over top of it. I think we can search here, Margaret Leiteritz. Yeah, I've searched for this before. Yeah, so even still, here's some more paintings from this series where these are some plots with clearly some errors on them. But I encourage folks to go and like dig into this collection, right? Because what it kind of says is that like, yeah, way back before we were doing this work, people were thinking about this as an art. And we should be thinking about it as an art. And like to think about conserving ink as an artistic practice is so fucking insane. So let's see what Frank has to say. I'm not a minimalist. So we're gonna I don't know. I haven't heard this, so let's find out. I just have a lot of opinions out of the gate around some tufty stuff. I've got some real feels. I feel like I kind of want my money back. But anyway, cool book collection, Ed. Anyway, let's get started.
Voice horizontal scroll bar. You are currently on heading not found. OBS Studio 31 visited link publication heading level 1 minimalism and the absurdity of the data to ink ratio. You are currently on a heading level 1. Heading level 1 minimalism and the absurdity of the data to ink ratio. How much minimalism is too much minimalism? I explore this question and propose the most minimalist, highest scoring data to ink ratio on a visualization ever made as a thought piece. Why? Well, novices learning to make data visualizations are often taught to avoid chart junk and strive towards visual minimalism, but they aren't told when to stop. Published on April 22, 2025. Edward Tufts Books. Link. Visual display of quantitative information. Visited. Link. Envisioning information. Link. Visual explanations. And. Link. Beautiful evidence. Combined have. Link. 29,010 citations, as of April 22nd, 2025 on Google Scholar. To say that Tufte has been influential in the field of data visualization would be an understatement. Few others have contributed as much impact as Tufte to the spread of ideas related to my field of work. Tufte has two specific ideas, both fixated on the design philosophy of minimalism, that I'd like to discuss in this piece. Chart junk and his data to ink ratio. Chart junk is a label given to visual decorations that are considered superfluous, meaningless, and even harmful to the central function of visualizing data, and the data to ink ratio is a rough heuristic for maximizing the information that a graphic can portray in as little ink, visual marks of any kind, as possible. Both of these ideas have been hotly contested in the visualization research literature. How do we really know whether visual decorations are harmful? First, how do we even consider something as chart junk? And then second, how do we observe what effects chart junk actually has? And with the data to ink ratio, how do we objectively measure what data is? And then how do we accurately measure the ink used to communicate that data? Exploring these questions has been about as effective as bringing a squirt gun to fight the ocean. Empirical research, unlike Tufte's opinion-based approach, has comparatively nearly 1/20 of the collective citations as Tufte's thoughts. Even if researchers are right in questioning easy, unnuanced design notions like chart junk or the data to ink ratio, we are virtually powerless to stop the force of Tufte's immense existing impact on how people think about visualization. Heading level 2. If you can't fight the death grip of minimalism on modern thought, can we embrace it to the extreme? So perhaps we cannot win in the marketplace of ideas against someone like Tufte. Easy to recall rules that make young professionals feel like they have powerful expertise over a complex domain like visual design are hard to conquer. Essentially, asking for measured, mature designerly consideration is simply not as Edward Tufte's book. Heading level 2. If you OBS Studio 3 Edward Tufte's book. So perhaps we cannot win in the marketplace of ideas against someone like Tufte. Easy to recall rules that make young professionals feel like they have powerful expertise over a complex domain like visual design are hard to conquer. Essentially, asking for measured, mature designerly consideration is simply not as popular, and perhaps never will be, as giving someone fast, naive design heuristics. You are currently on a selectable text.
Oh, cool.
So perhaps we cannot win in the marketplace of ideas against someone like Tufte. Easy to recall rules that make young professionals feel like they have powerful expertise over a complex domain like visual design are hard to conquer.
Oh man, that's so brutal. Make them feel that way. No, it's so true. It's like this dude is just a fucking critic, and if you're an artist, nobody likes that, right? So it's I don't know. I've always found like I never understood why we don't talk about like the foreground and the background and the midground and the weight of the lines and the tone of the lines and all those kinds of things. There's so much like significance. It's almost just like we got a whole bunch of color and we never learned how to put ink on the page, right? Because it's just been pixels. And this is what's weird, right? Like, anyway, let's keep going. This is great stuff. Thanks for writing these things, Frank. These are really hard topics to broach because everybody loves this dude, except for the people who hate him on Twitter. Man, the people who, well, when there was a place. Anyway, fuck it. Let's go.
Essentially, asking for measured, mature designerly consideration is simply not as popular, and perhaps never will be, as giving someone fast, naive design heuristics. So what if we just take Tufte's idea as pure law? What if we made a visualization with as little chart junk as possible and the largest data to ink ratio score imaginable? Here, we will work with a simple data that has two columns. The first column is categorical and the second is quantitative. The data represents the frequency of letters, rounded, as they occur. Here, we will work with a heading level 1, minimalism and the absurdity of the data to ink ratio. How much minimalism is too much? Edward Tufte's books. Link. Visual display of quantitative information. Visited. Link. Envisioning information. 87 more items. Article. Link. From Wikipedia. Here, we will work with a simple data that has two columns. The first column is categorical. Link. From Wikipedia. Full stop. We will try to maximize our data to ink and visualize this as minimally as possible. Row 1 of 8, column 1 of 2. Letter. Column 2 of 2. Percent. Row 2 of 8, column 1 of 2. A. Column 2 of 2. 8. Row 3 of 8, column 1 of 2. B. Column 2 of 2. 2. Row 4 of 8, column 1 of 2. C. Column 2 of 2. 3. Row 5 of 8, column 1 of 2. D. Column 2 of 2. 4. Row 6 of 8, column 1 of 2. E. Column 2 of 2. 13. Row 7 of 8, column 1 of 2. F. Column 2 of 2. 2. Row 8 of 8, column 1 of 2. G. Column 2 of 2. 2. A bar chart might be our first attempt to show this data. A basic bar chart. already pretty minimal. Figure, a bar chart of the previous data. Image, a basic bar chart, already pretty minimal. So the bars technically have pixels. Since this is a bitmap image, that means we can quantify our ink usage here. For now, let's not count the pixels of our use of text. So the bars have a hue encoding as well. So there is a second dimension encoded here. We will add up the pixels of all the bar heights, 1081 pixels, and then multiply that by the width of the bars, 70, and then again by 2 for using a color. We also have an axis line that is 1 pixel thick and 718 pixels wide. We will want to add that onto the previous total. So for now, we get a total ink value of 151,340 plus 718. Since data is a constant, we can set that to 1. Our first design's data to ink ratio is 152,058. Full stop. So technically the hue here isn't adding anything, and the axis line is useless too. Plus, the contrast of the text is too high. We aren't counting text here towards our ink score, but let's reduce that anyway. To fix this, let's use the lightest contrast colors for geometries. Number 949,004.
There's something to not treating text as ink. That's fucking bad shit. Right. I don't know. I think the place that I'm at, where I'm thinking, anyway, this probably isn't in there, but I'm going to interject my shit. But, I think it's interesting to think about visualization as a typography problem instead. Most of the glyphs are characters. It brings in emojis. It sort of gets more back to letterpress, which used fucking ink on letters. God. Anyway, no, I understand. No, I don't think I'm knocking like this specific thing. It's more like, it's just like there's these weird interpretations about this stuff. Like, so much of this stuff actually needs to be done in text because, like, I think if I shut the fuck up, we'll actually get to a place where we start to think about the, like, origins of art are actually in the non-visual. So I'm just gonna keep going. Anyway, I've got feelings today. Oh, here we go.
194, and text, number 767,676, that we can while still, link, passing accessibility standards, full stop. Technically, we still want to be accessible according to standards. We can't go too far in hue and lightness reduction. A more minimal bar chart. Figure, a bar chart of the previous data, using gray bars and lighter text. Image, a more minimal bar chart. Well, if we calculate this ratio for this one, it's much lower. The 718 from the axis line is gone and the hue is removed. So that extra dimension is gone. This one is 75,670. Better, but we can go a lot further. That is still far too much ink. In Tufts fashion, I don't remember which book this is in, but we can volume slider for Mac OS screen capture. Better, but we can go 1. Firefox. Minute better, but we can 75,670. Well, if we a bar chart of the previous data using gray bars and lighter text. Image a more minimal bar chart. Group. You are currently in Tufts fashion. I don't remember which book this is in, but we can accurately get rid of all the useless filling of the bars themselves and just leave the tops, marking the only part of their position that matters. Our data, ink ratio is improving. Who needs bars anyway? Figure, a chart of the previous data, with light gray lines where the top of the bars used to be instead of bars. Image, our data, ink ratio is improving. Who needs bars anyway? This chart is much better. Now we're much more minimal. So each of the 7 bars are only 5 pixels tall. That's 5 tall by 70 pixels wide by 7 marks total. Our data, ink ratio is skyrocketing now, at 2,450. Full stop. We've gone down a whole order of magnitude. But honestly, why did we stop there? Why waste all that ink making these bars so wide? We can take this design further. Technically, the smallest marks possible make for the best visualizations. They waste as little ink as possible. Figure, a chart of the previous data, with small squares where the top of the bars used to be instead of bars. Image, technically, the smallest marks possible make for the best visualizations. They waste as little ink as possible. Now each mark is only 5 pixels wide by 5 pixels tall. At 7 marks, that's a data, ink ratio of 175. Full stop. We've gone down another order of magnitude. Well, some of you might be looking at this design and find it hard to perceive. Well, guess what? That's what minimalism is all about. Technically, according to accessibility standards, there is no regulation for minimum sizes. This is not only a highly efficient, chart junk-free visualization, but it is also technically accessible. Amazing. But yes, you guessed it, we can go even further. Dear reader, are you familiar with what?
I haven't looked at anything. I've been sitting here drawing. Oh, that is quite minimal. Yeah, no, it's interesting, right? Because like so much of Tufte's work and Tufte's critique comes from print media. There are some times where the digital's referenced, and you start to see powerful things like the common fate gestalt. I mean, basically, like, visualization is just putting together different gestalt forms to, like, see how withholding you want to be. Minimalism is about withholding, and I'm gonna keep going.
Link. Code golf. It's a sport, of sorts, where people attempt to reduce the number of characters they use in source code in order to solve a problem. It tends to result in comically terse, virtually unreadable lines of code, but it still gets the job done. One of the best places to witness this recreational exercise is over on the link. Code golf stack exchange. Full stop. So what if we go to the extreme? Here with our data to ink ratio, what if we try to visualize our data using the smallest amount of ink possible? For this data set and using a modern, pixel-based display or rendering, I believe that this is the solution. Data to ink ratio meets code golf. I call it ink golf, where you try to use the smallest amount of ink possible in order to maximize the data to ink ratio of a visualization. Figure, a chart of the previous data. However, it is imperceptibly small. Each data point is a single pixel and even the text has been made into a minimal number of pixels to match. Image. Data to ink ratio meets code golf. I call it ink golf, where you try to use the smallest amount of ink possible in order to maximize the data to ink ratio of a visualization. Each data point is represented by only a single pixel. For our data set of 7 points, this data ink ratio is a massive 1:7. Full stop. This would surely make Edward Tufte happy. Obviously, this is the pinnacle of data visualization design. Heading level 2. Minimalism has been a way for some intellectuals to enforce aesthetics as law. So while this exercise was meant as a play,
Definitely, the aesthetics piece here is kind of key to a lot of, like, long-standing theory. This is such a sick article. Seriously, I love when Frank writes shit. Um, and yeah, it seems like other people do too. But anyway, let's keep on cruising.
full exploration in my new sport, ink golf. I do want to make the point that the graphic above is, obviously, inaccessible in its design. Virtually nobody would find this design useful or effective and it is likely an unusable artifact. I am certain that Tufte wouldn't defend this design with any seriousness, and certainly wouldn't intend for his philosophies to be taken this far, either. But yet, followers of minimalism always seem to stop at a certain point. Why? Why stop once you, the author of a visualization, are barely able to see what you've made? How do you know that what you see is adequate for what others see? Is your perception of minimalism the same as your audience's? Is minimalism, with so few real rules or empirically observed benefits, worth defending with such passion and fervor? Minimalism becomes a barrier, if taken too far. And this is the question I want to raise. When is too far? When do we decide that minimalism is excluding people from using our data visualizations? Accessibility standards don't save us. They currently don't set a minimum size for text or objects in a visualization. We do have plenty of research on link, just noticeable differences, or JNDs. However, but these aren't modeled after people with visual disabilities like low vision or blindness. So using these models wouldn't be helpful if we really wanted to know when minimalism starts to hit practical limits in design. So my lesson for you, dear reader, is this: don't take minimalism so seriously. The data to ink ratio is not a law, and as Derrida Akbaba says, perhaps, link, it is time to put the idea of chart junk in the trash. 2. Horizontal separator. For fun, here is a zoomed in version of my ink golf solution, so you can see that I even custom made a font in order to make this as small as possible. I reckon there might be some pixel configurations that can represent these letters in fewer pixels, but I couldn't solve it. I suppose that's the fun of golf. Perhaps a lower score is possible. You're welcome to give it a try, as long as you remember that minimalism should be used for fun more than it is for any sort of deadly, professional seriousness. Full stop. Yes, I even tried to do ink golf with the text. Now that I think about it, maybe we can start using ink golf as a way to poke fun at those deadly serious business intelligence utilitarians who seem to defend minimalism with such fervor. They're just ink golfing enthusiasts. Figure, a zoomed in version of the super small chart, showing that there really are only 7 pixels total for the data. The A is made with 5 pixels, B with 6, C with 3, D with 6, E with 6, F with 5, and G with 7. Image. Yes, I even tried to do ink golf with the text. Now that I think about it, maybe we can start using ink golf as a way to poke fun at those deadly serious business intelligence utilitarians who seem to defend minimalism with such fervor. They're just ink golfing enthusiasts. Hello from Pittsburgh. Last build on April 23, 2025. Groove. April 2025. Link. See a
That was a really fun article. But yeah, no, it's weird, right? There is a tendency for new visualization folks to cram 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound sack, just just like early programmers may desire to, right? But there is a proper configuration of these things, and it's actually non-visual. I'm actually gonna, I think we can work towards that. I got this other paper that's fucking cool. It basically, like, I think, Frank ended with aesthetics here. And I think what is cool about overlap with the next paper I'm going to share, or the next essay,
https://www.mtosmt.org/issuesmt.
the silence of frames here. It talks about silence as a frame to
OBS fade 300 ms. No action
talks about
available. Menu
silence as
button.
a
You are
frame for
currently on a
music.
vertical slider. To start interacting.
And this concept of a frame is really important, right? Like, if we want to consider visualization to be art, the frame is an important matter. And this article talks about sort of a battle between Kant and Derrida, trying to deconstruct his ideas of aesthetics and sort of saying that there's an inside and an outside. But that's really the idea. Like, so much of a visualization is about the observer's participation and experience with it. So it's not just the work and the labor of the authorship of the visualization, but it's the work and the labor of the viewer connecting with it also. So this is where the framing is important, and how they see it. Do they see it on a web page? Do they see it on a phone? Do they see it on a watch? And all of these different layers here, like, the common theme is not visualization. The common theme is some data frame or some frame of data underneath it. So, like, let's try and connect some weird, some theory, some critical theory, music theory. I mean, like, we're really deep in music theory territory, right? Since we're talking about
OBS fade
Tufte,
300 ms. No action available. Voiceover off.
since we're talking about Tufte now, I always got mad that he just, like, I paid money to watch him show off his fucking book collection. But here I am doing the same thing. But I don't know. This is a copy of John Cage's Silence. And there's, like, the piece, what is it, like 459 or something like that. And this book's, like, really stunning work in composition, right? So, like, typographic composition and printing. There are different games that are played to create these writings. There's different rule sets, and it's really fun. And there's, like, a real intense musicality in this work from John Cage, and it almost lends itself to the idea that even, the music is typographic at a certain point. When we're doing assistive tech, when we're doing these things and it's a wave, it's typographic. When there's an audio file underneath of it, it's something, typographic. It might look fuck ugly, but, like, it's kind of crazy that, like, some ugly ass input could be something as beautiful as some music that you really care about. So yeah, no, silence is an important thing, and being able to spend your time with silence, also important. So let's keep on fucking doodling and listen to this essay on silence. I'm going to have Samantha keep on guiding us through. I'm just getting used to using voiceover on a laptop. I'm pretty good with it on mobile, but this shit is awkward. But anyway, let's go. So what I think I'm going to try and do is I'm going to turn it on, try and find a heading, and then read from there is my plan. So let's go and try and turn it on.
Voiceover on OBS. OBS Studio. Firefox. MTO 2.
Okay.
HTTPS://
Find a
Heading level
heading.
1. The silence of the frames. You are
And then we're
currently
just
on
going
a
to
heading.
read.
Heading level 1. The silence of the frames. Link. Image. Comma. MTO. 96.2.1 Littlefield HTML. Heading level 2. Link. Richard C. Littlefield. Keywords. Aesthetics. Analysis. Context. Semiotics. Silence. Frame. Cone. Kant. Derrida. Abstract.
Sometimes there's this amateur thing that experts do and I think visualization's one of these things. You're like, oh, I'm so good in my field because I understand this convoluted visualization, and it's like, dude, you just spit on your hand and did the secret handshake with some other guy. Like, you don't understand complicated things at the end of the day. And the other thing that really fucking gets me is when programmers are like, oh, the second hardest problem in programming is naming. And then it's like, no, that's like a really like shit ass way to ignore like a whole fucking field of semiotics. Man, ink just went everywhere. Great. See, sometimes when in the visualization, has ink ever gone everywhere for you? I've definitely fucked it up before, but like, yeah, never ruins my clothes. Anyway, blah. This other ink that's in here has like these like gold flakes. I don't know. There we go. Keep giving it a mix. Yeah. Second hardest problem in computing is naming. And that's not true. It's only one if you make it. And what's interesting is if you have, like, oftentimes if you have a data frame, like, you have, like, the whole fucking world. Like, once you load in some data, all your visualizations are actually derived from that. So, oh no. The frame of the visualization is the thing that I think is important. It's not necessarily the ink. It's sort of this work around the work. Anyway.
This essay concerns the edges of musical works, and how those edges are made possible by various frames, especially that of silence. Silence as musical frame is viewed as an index of the more general issue of aesthetic framing. I approach that issue via a reading of Edward Cohn's theory of framing silence, as viewed through the aesthetic theories of Immanuel Kant and Jacques Derrida. From that reading I derive a typology of silence as musical frame. That typology is used to effect a reversal of hierarchy in some commonly accepted aesthetic oppositions, such as sound/silence and work/non-work. Link. PDF text. Link. PDF examples. Volume 2. Number 1. January, 1996. Copyright signed 1996 Society for Music Theory. Horizontal separator. Heading level 5. Link. 1. Introduction. Heading level 5. Link. 2. Frame and framing. Kant and Derrida. Heading level 5. Link. 3. Silence as musical frame. Heading level 5. Link. 4. Conclusion. Horizontal separator. 1. Introduction. 1.1. In the course of deconstructing Kant's critique of pure judgment, Jacques Derrida questions Kant's evaluation of the picture frame as mere ornamentation to the artwork proper. Jacques Derrida. Paragon. A chapter in his The Truth in Painting. Trans Jeff Heading level 5. 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 Heading level 5.
Okay, so the problem with this approach so far is I don't ever know where the virtual cursor is, and I don't know how to know where that is. So if anybody knows,
Heading level 5. Link. Heading
okay.
level 5. Heading level 5. Heading level 5. Link. Heading level 5. 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 1. Link. 1. Fastening on details that escape Kant's notice. Derrida ascribes some interesting functions to the frames, though he does not explore the possibility. It seems to me that these framing functions might apply to musical as well as visual art, and help answer the main question of the present essay. What goes on at the borders of a musical work? This essay is an expanded and revised version of a paper presented at the Summer Congresses of the International Semiotics Institute. Heading level 5. Link. 4. Conclusion. This essay is an expanded and revised version of a paper presented at the Summer Congresses of the International Semiotics Institute at Imatra, Finland, July 18, 1992. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Ctrl, Option, Space.
Shit, I guess I gotta continue it. Man, this nib is getting chunky. So that's like the other thing too. It's like just thinking about like data ink. Like you gotta think about the nibs, another material around. Oh no, it is unfortunate that so many people consider it. So what do I do now? I'm going to go right,
1.2.
and then I'm going to
1.2.
read.
The subject of musical borders leads to the more general aesthetic issue of how art is contextualized such that it appears as a work. This last is taken here in its commonly accepted definition, at least since the Renaissance, of an opus perfectum et absolutum, a finished man-made product, a self sufficient entity sui generis that exists beyond the place and time of its creation. Locating the work is crucial, for in order to get on with analysis, criticism, and the like, one must decide precisely what is work and what is non-work. It seems safe to say that most analyses of musical structure usually proceed as Alice was told to do. They begin at the beginning and go on to the end. This common sense attitude toward the givenness of a musical work's limits, however, is rarely theorized from an aesthetic point of view. Here, the term aesthetic is intended in its traditional and technical, romantic, sense of a systematic theory of art, and especially of art that typifies the beautiful discussed below. For a cogent elucidation of the history of aesthetics, from its inception in the mid-negative 1700s to its more utopian construal in the late 19th century, see Tsvetan Todorov, Theories of the Symbol, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1982, Chapter 6. I discuss elsewhere some of the ideological impact that aesthetics has on musical values. In Richard Littlefield and David Neumeyer, Rewriting Schenker, Narrative History Ideology, Music Theory Spectrum, 14/1, 1992, 38-65. Here, the term aesthetic is intended in its traditional and technical, romantic, sense of a systematic theory of art, and especially of art that typifies the beautiful discussed below. For a cogent elucidation of the history of aesthetics, from its inception in the mid-negative 1700s to its more utopian construal in the late 19th century, see Tsvetan Todorov, Theories of the Symbol, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1982, Chapter 6. I discuss elsewhere some of the ideological impact that aesthetics has on musical values. In Richard Littlefield and David Neumeyer, Rewriting Schenker, Narrative History Ideology, Music Theory Spectrum 14/1, 1992, 38-65. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Ctrl, Option, Space. Enter the present essay. Enter the present essay. Here I approach the issue of aesthetic musical context via a typology of the musical frame of silence. 1.3 Mention of how music is contextualized might lead one to expect a discussion of musical ontology. A massive literature on that topic runs, at least, from Sextus Empiricus's skeptical dictum that music does not exist, because it must exist in time, but time does not exist, thus neither can music, to modern studies in cognition and psychology, which understand music as primarily a mental construct, to essentialist views of music, which take the artwork as a reification or hypostasis of the composer's thought, of emotive or psychological processes, of social structures, of absolute musical processes, and so on. Sextus Empiricus, Against the Musicians, Trans Denise Greaves, Lincoln, University of Nebraska Press, 1986, 2nd century AD. For a recent Gestaltist ontology of music, see Roman Ingertons, The Work of Music and the Problem of Its Identity, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1986. For Ingerton, and for Leonard Meyer before him, music exists fundamentally in the communion between listener and a concrete sounding object. Ingerton's study should be taken as only a recent, and not necessarily representative, example from a vast literature on music cognition and psychology, which I have neither the space nor the expertise to deal with here. For an interesting construal of art as a totally subjective mental phenomenon, see Morse Peckham, Man's Rage for Chaos, Biology, Behavior, and the Arts, Philadelphia, Chilton Books, 1965. Essentialist views of music are manifold. For recent representative examples post-dating the Pythagorean conception of music as sounding number, see Schenker's writings, Edward Cohn's, The Composer's Voice, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1974. On this issue in literary interpretation, see E.D. Hirsch Jr., The Aims of Interpretation, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1976. Sextus Empiricus, Against the Musicians, Trans Denise Greaves, Lincoln, University of Nebraska Press, 1986, 2nd century AD. For a recent Gestaltist ontology of music, see Roman Ingerton's The Work of Music and the Problem of Its Identity, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1986. For Ingerton, and for Leonard Meyer before him, music exists fundamentally in the communion between listener and a concrete sounding object. Ingerton's study should be taken as only a recent, and not necessarily representative, example from a vast literature on music cognition and psychology, which I have neither the space nor the expertise to deal with here. For an interesting construal of art as a totally subjective mental phenomenon, see Morse Peckham, Man's Rage for Chaos, Biology, Behavior, and the Arts, Philadelphia, Chilton Books, 1965. Essentialist views of music are manifold. For recent representative examples post-dating the Pythagorean conception of music as sounding number, see Schenker's writings, Edward Cohn's The Composer's Voice, Berkeley. Such ontic investigations are extreme.
Brutal. I guess, well, isn't it fun? Accessibility, you always have to be a shitty critique. See, I'm doing everything Tofty hates. Like, I understand the urge to do it. I'm sharing my books, and I'm shit talking stuff that wasn't like meant to get shit talked. But yeah, this is a really long uh popover that got repeated twice, I guess. But I think there's like some cool stuff that's coming out in the new browsers that's gonna make this a little bit make that problem a little bit easier to handle natively. So anyway, yeah, I guess when I'm doing this, I'm soaking it in. It took me a while to realize that that was a duplicate, but now I understand how it's a duplicate, so we can move on. And yeah, it's kind of not. I've been trying to figure out how to have a setup for drawing and doing some of this like streaming listening thing, and the stream deck's kind of cool because I've been able to like load in hotkeys for voiceover. So I'm trying to like figure out what I can do so I can just sort of like hit buttons, because like some of these buttons are like let's see, multiple to change like the voice, 5 buttons, to go back a heading, 5 buttons. It's I don't have enough fingers to do it. Like, so if yeah, I don't really know how, like, somebody would probably have to use sticky keys to do keyboard navigation if they struggled uh, with the keyboard. Yeah, anyway, let's go.
Extremely important, inasmuch as they elucidate the conditions of possibility for anything called music to exist, and a thorough study of aesthetic frames would have to make such an excursus. Such transcendental quests, however, lead to questions of the place of music in general knowledge rather than the more limited aesthetic issues that interest me here. Thus any ontological issues touched on here will be done so in passing. 1.4. Another approach to musical framing is found in analyses of musical closure. For one, Patrick McCrellis has theorized different types of closure in tonal music. For another, Naomi Cumming discusses syntactic frames, such as phrase and period.
Super interesting to hear closure in this, because that's a goddamn Gestalt principle, which is like when you make a subaxis closure. Think. I don't know. Anyway, there's some interesting overlap even in music and visual arts when you hear some of these Gestalt terms. Anyway.
Endings, with regard to their effect on a perceiving subject. Patrick McCrellis, The Hermeneutic Sentence and Other Literary Models for Tonal Closure. Indiana Theory Review, 12, 1991. 35-73, the author advances a theory of 3 types of musical closure: syntactic, poetic, and rhetorical, and his article contains a rich bibliography of other studies on musical closure. Naomi Cumming, The Subjectivities of Erbarmdheit, unpublished MS, 1995. Excerpts read at the National Meeting of the Society for Music Theory, New York, November 2, 1995. Patrick McCrellis, The Hermeneutic Sentence and Other Literary Models for Tonal Closure. Indeed, these studies, and others like them, shed light on one of the most salient features of musical structure. They do not, however, ask questions about how that structure is taken to be there in the first place, nor how types of framing make musical structures appear as a work. Therefore, discussion of syntactic framing will not be considered here, though in the ideal study of how syntactic and extrasyntactic frames wed, such discussion would be mandatory. You are currently on a text element.
This is where I think we're gonna start to find some really interesting things, because in data arts, in musical arts, in visual arts, the work is what's relevant. And it's kind of like interesting to think about like dataink as a goal, where it's as if the work is, there's this weird thing about where folks think that minimalism happens, and it's not a like actual process of complexity. Minimalism takes a lot of time, and it sometimes it works on time scales that like organizations don't actually have either. So what I think is important, like especially when we're moving forward with this framing concept, is like the non-work, like the non-data ink, in a minimal representation is much more significant than the non-data work in like an early visualization. It takes time. You have to like beat the shit out of your data, out of your representations. You might have to step away from it for time. You might not even have the data. It's sort of interesting, ink wise again, but more like pigment wise. Like at a time when people were making oil paintings, like the romantics and all that kind of stuff, their beautiful works might take decades, right? And during that time, like trade might have happened where they get like a new pigment, right? You want to talk about data ink, right? Like that's basically like new software dropping in like medieval times. So this concept of ink is, when you have ink, you have to work it. You have to work sort of with it, right? So, minimalism can like really force your story and sort of lead it astray. I think it leads to a lot of unnatural work, and non-work also, like talking about data ink, like is red herring, like Frank told. I mean, I've talked to Frank or a couple of times at this point, and we have some aligning ideas here. So none of this surprises me. I just like really am happy to see it in words, right? Because like for me, I see it in drawings in my head and in all of my papers, but like I can't communicate that shit to you, or to other folks. So it's really great that this conversation started, and it seems like a lot of people are into it. Anyway, I gotta stop talking.
1.5. In contrast to studies of intramusical framing such as those of closure, much recent writing on musical context stresses the extra-musical dimension of things such as socio-cultural, institutional, and pedagogical factors. For example, one recent publication contains an entire section of essays on musical contexts. Among the authors are Charles Hamm, on social contexts of listening that affect musical reception, Peter Rabinowitz, on how verbal texts help cultivate listening habits, John Neubauer, on academic and other institutional contexts of listening, and Ruth Soley, on patriarchy's use of music to advance its cause. You are currently on a selectable text. The mentioned essays are in
One
Stephen P.
paragraph
Scher,
at a time.
Music and Text, Critical Inquiries, Cambridge, England, Cambridge University Press, 1992. A more thorough critique of theories of musical context appears in my review of Music and Text, in Journal of Music Theory, 38/2, 1994, 343-53. There exists quite...
Other thing you got to consider about ink is that it's still wet. Oil paints stay wet for a while. I gotta like elevate my wrist to do some of these drawings because it's still wet. I just ripped the paper because it's so wet. But anyway, it takes time for these things to draw. I mean, I think like the best thing to come out of the data ink concept is that it does actually like connect data back to a physical, and people believe Tufty for some reason. So that's like one practical outcome of it. But this ink is additive and subtractive, which is a concept.
Computational heading level 3 on this page. Content list. Complementary.
I'm not
You
gonna
are
break on
current
that,
menu
but
bar. Tidy data.
that's another
Computational
thing.
color. Link. 6.
Anyway.
Article. 64.
Where were
1.5.
we?
In contrast to studies of intramusical framing such as those of closure, much recent writing on musical context stresses the extra-musical dimension of things such as these studies. In Popover, content is empty. Space with applications Firefox. Link. Space with application. These studies, and others like them, shed light on one of the most salient features of musical structure. They do not, However, ask questions about how that structure is taken to be there in the first place, nor how types of framing make musical structures appear as a work. Therefore, discussion of syntactic framing will not be considered here, though in the ideal study of how syntax Firefox has new window, these and other such studies of extra musical link, these studies, and other link, 5, 1.4, another approach to musical framing is found in analyses of musical closure. For one, these studies, and others like them, shed light on these studies, and others like them, shed light on one of the most salient, these studies, and others like them, shed light on one of, link, 6. These and other such studies of extra musical context serve as valuable link, 6. The mentioned essays, 1.5, in contrast to studies of intramusical framing such as those of closure, much recent writing on musical context stresses the extra-musical dimension of things such as socio-cultural, institutional, and pedagogical factors. For example, one recent publication contains an entire section of essays on musical contexts. Among the authors are Charles Ham, on social contexts of listening that affect musical reception, Peter Rabinowitz, on how verbal texts help cultivate listening habits, John Neubauer, on academic and other institutional contexts of listening, and Ruth Soley, on patriarchy's use of music to advance its cause. You are currently on a selectable text. Link, 6. The mentioned essays are in Stephen P. Scher, ed., Music and Text, Critical Inquiries, Cambridge, England, Cambridge University Press, 19. These and other such studies of extra-musical context serve as valuable reminders that boundaries between music and non-music are artificial at best, and the writers just mentioned generally understand music to be a phenomenological datum whose borders vary according to who hears it and the competencies those listeners possess. It is not surprising that writers who embrace this anti-essentialist view of music tend to eschew detailed structural analysis of the work itself, and instead focus on what music does rather than what it is. I accept the logic of this anti-essentialist view, but will provisionally accept the idea that something like music exists in and of itself. Not to accept it would end my essay here, since aesthetics arises in response to the notion that something people call beautiful art exists. You are currently on a text element. 1.6. Also, possibly relevant to the present essay would be music and writings by John Cage. There is no such thing as silence, and Toru Takemitsu. Silence is a sign of death. You are currently on a selectable text. John Cage. Both of these writers have brought us great insight into Eastern ways of understanding sound, music, and all of life, but because they proceed from such a fundamentally different epistemology than that of the West, to weave their conceptions of silence and music into an essay concerned with European aesthetics would
Yeah, it's almost like this Tufty things in epistemology that we're trying to overcome. It's weird how ingrained it is.
Require a much longer format than the present one. Thus Cage's silence as ambient noise and Takemitsu's silence as death must also await future study. 1.7. Instead of approaching the subject of silence as aesthetic frame via the possible routes just outlined in paragraphs 1.3-1.6, I shall instead look at Edward Cohn's attempt to answer aesthetic questions about the context of musical artworks in his classic musical form and musical performance. You are currently on a text element. Edward T. Cohn, Musical Form and Musical. There Cohn advances a theory of silence as musical frame, and my paper picks up where Cohn's leaves off, so to speak. Link, 1.7. Instead of approaching the subject of silence as aesthetic frame via the possible routes just outlined in paragraphs 1.3-1.6, I shall instead look at Edward Cohn's attempt to answer aesthetic questions about the context of musical artworks in his classic musical form and musical performance. You are currently on a text element. Link, 8. There Cohn advances a theory of silence as musical frame, and my paper picks up where Cohn's leaves off, so to speak. Here I view Cohn's theory through the lens of Derrida/Kant, using their writings as a framework or foil by which to read Cohn. You are currently on a text element. 1.8. The remainder of this essay will proceed as follows. First, I shall look at Derrida's views of aesthetic frames and framing, arrived at in his reading of Kant. Combining Derrida's views with Kant's, I derive a set of 4 self-negating framing functions that characterize and define any and all artistic frames. Second, I use those functions to interpret Cohn's theory of silence as musical frame. In brief, my interpretation affects a reversal of certain oppositions between music/silence, such that the unprivileged rightmost term is shown to be a condition of possibility for or constitutive of the former. I close with a few comments about how aesthetic frame theory, as interpreted by my reading of Cohn, might be useful for analysis and pertinent to the construction of a music aesthetic. You are currently on a selectable text. 2. Frame and framing, Kant and Derrida. You are currently 2. Frame and framing, Kant and Derrida. 2.1. In the section of his critique of judgment entitled Analytic of the Beautiful itself, Book I of the Analytic of Aesthetic Judgment, Kant describes the picture frame as a mere ornament, paragon, to the painting itself. He classifies the frame among ornaments that do not belong to the internal properties of the work, organ of art, even though such external trappings as picture frames and draper. Volume slider for McCox. You are currently Firefox. MTO 2.1. Littlefield. The Silence of the Frames. Window. 2.1. In the section of his critique of judgment entitled Analytic of the Beautiful Itself, Book I of the Analytic of Aesthetic Judgment, Kant describes the picture frame as a mere ornament, paragon, to the painting itself. He classifies the frame among ornaments that do not belong to the internal properties of the work, organ of art, even though such external trappings as picture frames and draperies or clothes on statues do attach to the work proper. Why does Kant need to make this distinction? As noted above, in order for analysis of anything called art to take place, and thus for aesthetics to be possible, it is crucial to define the proper, intrinsic object of critical attention. Derrida calls this determination a permanent requirement that organizes all philosophical discourses on art. Tip. 45. For Kant and his critical lineage, which we shall see includes Edward Cohn, that object is beautiful form. Such form is autonomous, organic, and autotelic, that is, seemingly goal-directed, but with no use in the outside world, and with no goal beyond simply being itself. Kant's free beauty, the best kind, signifies nothing, shows nothing, represents nothing. As a token of such beauty, music is the play of sensations in time, whose design, i.e., form, constitutes the proper object of the pure judgment of taste Kant quoted in. You are currently on a text element. Tip. 52-53. Now that which frames any artwork. 2.2. Now Derrida suggests that Kant's exclusion of the frame from evaluations of pure beauty is something of a swindle, because Kant tries to introduce a logical framework that makes it possible to distinguish work from non-work. For this task, Kant borrows categories from his Critique of Pure Reason, and these categories are irrelevant to the discussion at hand. Irrelevant because, according to Kant, aesthetics concerns the senses, not the intellect. We shall return to this problem toward the end of this essay. After watching the same kind of conceptual frame job bolster Cohn's theory of musical silence, Derrida goes on to show that the frame can be understood not only as mere ornament, but as that which makes possible the work itself, through action that separates the so-called beautiful form from a general context or milieu. For Derrida, the frame responds to and signifies a lack within the work itself. Tip. 65. This lack makes framing necessary, not just ornamental and contingent, as Kant would have it. In effect, Derrida reverses the hierarchical opposition established by Kant, that of work non-work. He does so, however, not by establishing a new opposition of non-work work, but rather by construing the oppositions involved as a set of paradoxes. You are currently on a text element. OBS to Mac OS screen. Volume slider for Mac OS. You are currently on a vertical slider.
Yeah,
Properties for my properties for my split group. Properties for my defaults button. Mac OS screen. Mac OS properties.
That's
Mac OS vertical
kind of
layout.
annoying.
Properties. Voiceover off.
Gotta get back to it. Properties. No. Properties. Advanced audio. I had the gain put up. It's hard for 2 point. Is it 2? That's, I didn't realize it did that. Okay, that should be better now. Back to it. Work and non-work, right? My when I'm making visualizations, I spend 90% of my time on the data frame and making sure that that shit's bulletproof. And that the content of it is too. I kind of take this approach more like a bicycle frame builder, where I want to build the jig. The table's the jig, and there's nothing I can really put onto a page or in a visualization that wouldn't be most amenable to a table format. So let's get to the paradoxes here. Sick.
Voiceover on
I
Firefox.
fucking love this
MTO
stuff.
2.1. Littlefield. The Silence of the Frame. 1.6. Both of these writers have brought us great insight into Eastern ways of understanding sound, music. 2.2. Now Derrida suggests that Kant's exclusion of the frame from 1.8. The remainder of the 2. Frame 2.1. TIP. 52.2. Those well read in deconstruct. Figure 1. Framing functions. Link. Image. Figure 1 thumbnail. You are click to enlarge. You are
Great
currently
alt
on a
text.
select 2.3. 4 of these paradoxical functions. 2.3. 4 of these paradoxical functions of the frame are listed at the bottom of figure 1. First, the frame separates the work from its context. In doing so, the frame enshrines an object, thereby bringing it to our attention as beautiful form or art. The frame provides us with an object that can have intrinsic content. Second, and at the same time, in any analysis of pure beauty, the frame must not be considered part of the artwork, even though physically attached to it. Thus the frame also separates the work from the frame itself. To summarize, in relation to the work, the frame seems to disappear into the general context. context, such as a museum wall, in relation to the general context, the frame disappears into the work. Therefore, the frame belongs fully to neither work nor external context. It has no place of its own. Only framing effects occur, which are not to be confused with the frame itself. There is framing, says Derrida, but the frame does not exist. Typ. 39. Link. Image. Figure 1 thumbnail. Click to enlarge. 2.3. 4 of these paradoxical functions of the frame are listed at the bottom of Figure 1. First, the frame separates the work from its context. In doing so, the frame enshrines an object, thereby bringing it to our attention as beautiful form or art. The frame provides us with an object that can have intrinsic content. Second, and at the same time, in any analysis of pure beauty, the frame must not be considered part of the artwork, even though physically attached to it. Thus, the frame also separates the work from the frame itself. To summarize, in relation to the work, the frame seems to disappear into the general context, such as a museum wall. In relation to the general context, the frame disappears into the work. Therefore, the frame belongs fully to neither work nor external context. It has no place of its own. Only framing effects occur, which are not to be confused with the frame itself. There is framing, says Derrida, but the frame does not exist. Typ. 39. 2.4 Functions 3 and 4 on Figure 1 are corollaries to this ambiguous ontology. Third, the frame comes to be viewed as contingent, as mere ornament. Fourth, at the same time, the frame must be considered necessary, since it functions to constitute the work. The frame defines the work by confining it. This is a paradox in the rigorous sense. The frame is not contingent or necessary, but both contingent and necessary at one and the same time. It is impossible to decide logically where the borders of the frame stop and the work begins, or where the borders of the work stop and the frame begins. 2.5. Yet as analysts we regularly decide anyway, rarely taking the time to theorize where works really begin and end. For a notable exception to this practice, and keeping in mind the 4 framing functions outlined above, I now
Yeah, when you're beating the crap out of a data frame, not many people see that labor. But it really just like helps having, I don't know, it's interesting because like it's almost like when you work with the data frame before you get to the visualization, it's like kneading clay. Like you kind of got to get all the bubbles out of it. You got to work it, you spend time with it, you understand it as a material. Some days it might be wetter than others. Sometimes you might get data that's a little bit dry, or it might feel like an entirely different clay. Maybe strings versus numbers, and you got to do some like text shit instead, or lots of categories, or it's wide, These are all different, I guess, kinds of clay or data. Maybe data material is interesting concept, right? Because like from data material perspective, you can actually consider like what's included and what's thrown away, right? Because there's actually a lot of waste in the data visualization process. Just like, anyway.
Heading level 5. Heading level 5. Head 2.4 Function 3. Silence as musical frame. Launchpad 1 of 1. You are currently on a 2.4 Functions 3 and 4 on Figure necessary at one and the same time. It is impossible to decide logically where the heading level 5. Heading level 5. 3.1. In his chapter on the picture. 3.1. In his chapter on the picture and the frame, Kohn elegantly rearticulates Kant's notions of pure beauty, and how the latter must be separated from things external to itself. The frame of a picture marks the limits not only of the picture, but also of the real world around the picture. First, it separates the subject chosen for treatment from its own imagined surroundings. Second, it protects the work from the encroachment of its external environment. MFMP 14-15. Kohn's emphasis. Kohn goes on to note that, unlike painting, music has no internal environment. By this he means that music essentially has no representational content, as does narrative, painting, sculpture, and the like. Nevertheless, music stands in great need of a frame to separate it from its external environment. MFMP 16. That frame is silence. Of course, silence is not the only musical frame. As Kohn points out, certain types of introductions and postludes can have framing effects, as defined by our 4 functions. MFMP 23-24. More abstractly, a composer's signature can frame a work by delimiting audience expectations, establishing ownership, and separating it from works of other composers. Discourse about music can frame its reception. When literary genres, for instance, epic, such as Schenker's Hero Artist in his Harmonielehre, and neutral reportage, are used to frame musicological arguments, they can produce auras of authority and reality, respectively. Also, the borders of musical works change over time and according to performance context. For example, a macho mass may be framed as a concert piece, whereas it once served to frame church liturgy. Today it seems that Satie's dream of music as furniture has come true. Music, no longer made to be listened to, serves as a frame that keeps out the so-called real world. This is evident from the omnipresence of music as background, in stores, restaurants, markets, and in the popularity of Walkman headsets. But the issue of musical frames changing over time is more an issue for cultural semiotics than for the present discussion. Of course, silence is not the only musical frame. As Kohn points out, certain types of introductions and postludes can have framing effects, as defined by our four functions. MFMP 23-24. More abstractly, a composer's signature can frame a work by delimiting audience expectations, establishing ownership, and separating it from works of other composers. Discourse about music can frame its reception. When literary genres, for instance, epic, such as Schenker's Hero Artist in his Harmonielehre, and neutral reportage, are used to frame musicological arguments, they can produce auras of authority and reality, respectively. Also, the borders of musical works change over time and according to performance context. For example, a macho mass may be framed as a concert piece, whereas it once served to frame church liturgy. Today it seems that Satie's dream of music as furniture has come true. Music for Kohn. In musical performance, silence as a type is instantiated by token silences that play a variety of framing roles. We shall now look at the individual functions of framing silence according to Kohn, and also consider a few silences he omits. You are currently on a text element. Figure 2. A oscillograph-like representation of music in action. You are currently on a text element. Link image. Figure 2 thumbnail. You are click to enlarge. 3.2. To help visualize these frames, Figure 2 gives an oscillograph-like representation of music in action, and shows framing silences that lie at the music's edges. Along the horizontal axis, sounds appear in time. The vertical axis shows the musical highs and lows in terms of pitch, space, or frequency. Silences A and B represent the horizontal borders of a sounding piece of music, and each has a different function. The beginning silence, A, is that moment in which nothing should be happening. MFMP 16. Kohn's emphasis. It mutely announces, here the real world leaves off and the work of art begins. Here the work of art ends and the real world takes up again. MFMP 15. In a typical concert situation, this silence usually precedes a conductor's first gesture. You are currently on a text element. 3.3. Kohn's italicized nothing, however, should alert us that 3.3. Kohn's italicized nothing, however, should alert us that something is going on here. The beginning silence serves as a call to attention. It focalizes the listener toward what will follow. It finalizes a milieu. These are of course phenomenological attributions, and yet that silence is heard. Even empirically, the beginning silence has a propulsive quality, a sense of doing. The capitalization of certain verbs designates them as technical terms in modal logic, which formalizes the processes of certain modalities, or subjunctive linguistic moods. Such verbs include willing, wanting, needing, and so on. Eero Terasti incorporates the modal logic of semioticians and logicians, such as A.J. Grimus and Henrik von Wright respectively, and musicologist Charles Seeger in his theory of musical semiotics. Among other things, Terasti's theory accounts for the interaction of certain modal states either induced or exemplified by tonal and rhythmic structures. See Terasti, A Theory of Musical Semiotics, Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 1995. On the modalities in general semiotics, see A.J. Grimus and Jacques Fontenelle, The Semiotics of Passions, Minneapolis, University of Minnesota Press, 1993, especially 1-43. The capitalization of certain verbs designates it is modalized, or charged with moods, by the audience's expectations of what will follow, even if what follows is unknown to the listener. Out of this silence the music officially begins. This initial modalization can be affected by the conductor's first gesture, which serves as a visual cue that further premodalizes the sounds to come. For example, the silent downbeat to the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony calls forth high energy in preparation for the urgent motive that follows. On the other hand, the conductor's first gesture can imbue the propulsive beginning silence with a feeling of relaxation, of being, as would be appropriate, say, for the pastoral opening of Sibelius's Second Symphony. In such cases, Kohn speculates, perhaps some of the silence, once called the, as in only, frame by Kohn immediately before a composition is actually a part, not of the frame, but of the work itself. MFMP 17-18. This is Kant's good ornamentation, a frame that participates in the work itself. Yet does this not suggest that the work proper somehow depends on the frame, or that in certain cases the frame does not depend on the work itself but rather forms a part of it? Recall that, in this, romantic, aesthetic, which treasures organicism as a sign of good art, pure beauty, anything extraneous or unnecessary to the beautiful form is considered a flaw. Thus for the ornament to take part in the work proper either makes that ornament more than ornament or makes the work proper something less than proper, or at least.
It's just saying that minimalism is for old people. Full-blown maximalism, go!
As derrida suggests, some confusion arises between inner and outer, between frame and framed, something abyssal, where the smallest circle inscribes, in itself the figure of the largest and does so ad infinitum. Tip 27.
fuck now. Go.
Figure 3. Possible interpretation. Link. Click to enlarge. 3.4. We have not yet exhausted the richness and function of the beginning edge of the silent frame. Figure 3 shows some possible interpretations of a beginning musical silence. In semiotic terms, if one takes the beginning silence as a sign, it might generate the chain of interpretations shown as an idealized hearing. As a type, it forms an iconic, or similarity, relationship with all the interior silences to follow in the piece. The beginning silence also functions symbolically, since as a call to attention it is established by conventions and protocols of concert going rather than by any inherent property it might have, and on the principle of contiguity, it serves as an index in relation to the music that follows, inasmuch as both sound and silence share the property of duration. Figure 3 also suggests that, at some indefinable point, the beginning silence becomes part of the music itself. The frame has erased itself and yet it was as there as any note was. A part of the general context has contaminated or become part of that which is to be understood as self-sufficient, proper only to itself. It is impossible to say exactly where contextual, ambient silence becomes part of the work proper. We have reached one of Cage's conclusions, but via a different route. Further, the idealized hearing shown in Figure 3 gives only possible interpretations and assumes much that we cannot take for granted, such as our hearing in an orderly, or serial, fashion instead of projecting backwards and forwards. And we haven't yet mentioned noise from the general context that might contaminate the frame itself, such as talkers, the crackling of candy wrappers, and so on. In this case another reversal occurs, where, in order to listen with Kant's cone's ears, we must construe the sound as silence so that the silence we construe as sounding, part of the work proper, can be heard. You are currently on a text element. 3.5. Silence B of Figure 2, the ending border of the music, may be qualified as mainly absorptive, because it captures and dispels the energy of the preceding sounds. This ending silence protects us from the shock of our return to ordinary time and should not be intruded on too quickly with applause, lest its function be thwarted. MFMP 16. The ideal duration of this ending silence will depend on the energy level of the foregoing sounds and their lingering effects on our memory. For example, the silence that frames the end of Debussy's Clair de Lune takes little time to dispel the low energy of the preceding music. In contrast, the bombastic chords that end Sibelius's Fifth Symphony seem to hammer away long after they are gone, and require lengthy silence to dissipate their force. Silence B can also have a propulsive quality, as silence A, when occurring in multi-movement constructs such as suites, symphonies, and concertos. In these cases and others, silences between movements can also prepare, delimit, or point to what follows. As Kohn says, these moments of silence represent frame, like the intermediate frames of a triptych. MFMP 17. For instance, the silence after the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony can be very passive, if one is thinking ahead to the tranquil theme of the second movement. Another example would be the active silence that occurs just after the introduction to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, right before the Danse des Adolescentes begins. The quality or mood of a silence between movements will also depend on how long the conductor makes the silence. A framing effect might be lost between movements, if the succeeding movement is begun too soon, without enough time in between for the previous music to leave the memory. In that case, does framing occur? Once the new movement is underway, will there be a retrospective imposition of frame? And will that frame be silent? Given all these questions about the silent frames or the framing silences, it begins to seem that, in all rigor, they cannot be classified as mere ornament, as somehow less essential than that which they frame. You are currently on a text element. Example 1. Verdi, Regal, link, click to 3.3.7, referring again, 3.6. We have considered beginning and ending silences as frames. Are there other, perhaps internal, frames? Kohn does not think so. Rather, he construes certain types of non-silences, i.e., sounds, such as preludes and postludes, the extremes of a composition, as frames. MFMP 22. Yet framing silences do not take place only at beginnings and endings. The scare quotes should need no explanation by now. They also occur, at least potentially, within the music itself. For instance, in the aria La Donna e Mobile from Act 4 of Verdi's Rigoletto, a fermata appears over one silent measure of rest during the instrumental that follows the first verse. See Example 1. If the conductor makes this rest last long enough, the interior silence might generate the interpretation of a new beginning. An easy way to test this reading is to play the interlude, first giving the fermata a duration of 5 or 6 beats, to hear the silence as an interruption, then 10 or 11 beats, to hear the pause as a new beginning, where emphasized. Internal silences tend to be heard as interruptions of continuity, and indeed, almost reverse the accepted hierarchy in the opposition sound silence. I return to questions of reversed hierarchy at the end of this paper. For now, let's continue with our typology of frames. You are currently on a text element. 3.7. Referring again to Figure 2, you will notice bordering silences also in the vertical, registral dimension. These vertical borders of the frame are mentioned by neither Kohn nor Kant, yet we clearly have at least two ways of construing these kinds of framing silence, which are more empirically silent than silences at either the beginning or the ending. First, silences C and D lie at the limits of human hearing capacity. These borders are normative and what we may call natural, because they are determined by physical limitation and the infinite range of possible sound vibrations incidentally. The fact that silences C and D are natural would seem to qualify them as inherently beautiful. In Kant's Kohn's aesthetics, For the romantic view included first and foremost among the defining traits of beauty those processes most akin to those found in nature, hence, the prizing of organicism and all that term entails. Second, the tones of the piece itself can determine vertical borders. The highest and lowest pitches establish borders that confine a piece of music to a certain registral space. Unlike the silence that occurs at the limits of human hearing capacity, the highs and lows produced by the piece itself are constrained by conventions of musical style and genre, and by the physical and mechanical limitations of instruments and/or voices used. In this case, the work itself acknowledges or compensates for its own framing silences, which the highest and lowest pitches fend off. Another reversal of...
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like back to the visualization thing. For so many people, it's a active creation, but there's so much omission that sort of happens in it. Yeah, there's a lot of work that happens in silence, like when the visualization is gaining, when it's a work of visualization, I guess.
Function takes place, instead of the imposition of frame from the outside, silence, lowered lights, conductor's gesture, etc. The framing occurs from the inside, by the work itself. The inside does the job of the outside in order for the inside to appear to be framed by the outside. A strange yet necessary illusion if something like a work of music is to be said to exist. 3.8. The vertical, or registral, silences, C and D, differ from the horizontal, or temporal silences, A and B. 3.9. Other speculation. 3.10. For Kohn, framing silences give the musical act its own fictional world. 3.11. One gains access to this other world. 3. Pierre, this mode of listen. 3.4.
Okay.
Conclusion. You are currently on a 3.13. This mode of listening focuses on the traits of sound independent of their syntactic function and means of production. And 3.13. I mention Kohn's modes of listening not only as a matter of interest nor as a prelude to a phenomenological theory of framing, but rather to recall that a similar imposition of external categories prompted Derrida's questioning of Kant's aesthetics. As noted in section I of this essay, much of Derrida's dissertation on the frame concerns Kant's use of the outside framework of reason, which Kant had designated in his Critique of Pure Reason as playing no part in aesthetic judgments, to conceptualize the essentially aconceptual realm of feelings and taste. In Kant's aesthetics, says Derrida, a logical frame is transposed and forced in to be imposed on a non-logical structure. TIP 69. A similar move takes place in Kohn. He calls in his two modes of listening at the same time as he returns the discussion, near the end of MFMP, to differences between art and non-art. 88-96. The chapters in which the discussions of art versus non-art take place in fact frame what is usually understood to be the content of the book. A theory of rhythm as the basis of form. Like Kant, Kohn is faced with a lack of categories, and must smuggle them in, disguised as mere accessories and ornament, when trying to define the edges of a work of content-less, non-representational, labile and sounding art. Kohn relies on the framing metaphor of outside structures of content that, representational, static and visual painting. He further calls in selected phenomenological categories of listening, in order to frame his own highly persuasive, if ultimately suspect, aesthetics. You are currently on a text element. 3.14. At the risk of over-summarizing, I won't pursue further the congruences in logic between Kohn's aesthetics and Kant's, though such a project would likely prove interesting. Instead, let me close with a few general observations that seem to follow from the typology of framing silences and from the too brief analysis just given them. I begin with a look at the treatment of silence in normal music analysis, and close with some remarks on framing silence, and on aesthetic frames in general. You are currently on a selectable text. 4. Conclusion. You are currently on a selectable text. 4.1. In normal music analysis and interpretation, musical silence, like the picture frame, tends to erase itself, in their role as crucial structural determinants, a role which I hope has been successfully argued above. Silences rarely figure into systematic accounts of the musical act, just as in the recollection of a novel. Criticism usually does not go to spaces between lines, paragraphs, sections, and chapters. This remains the case, despite the fact that many 20th century works, such as those by Webern, Feldman, Crumb, Parrott, and others consist mainly of silences that are more salient than those in the various works of music mentioned above. Yet criticism and structural analysis usually focus on sounding musical events, leaving silence to be considered incidental, a mere accessory to the work proper. In the analysis business, there is as much silence about the frames as well as of them, and when they are mentioned at all, as in Kant, Kohn and Derrida, they receive much more attention than such a mere accessory or hors d'oeuvre would seem to require. There is a certain urgency, in these writers and in all aesthetics, to give us something with intrinsic content. In romantic aesthetics, that something is the work itself, pure of essence, and uncontaminated by externals. Perhaps this urgency to peg the frame as accessory, unnecessary, adjunct, and so on comes from a presentiment that, instead of the work itself, the frame should be the proper focus of analysis and criticism. You are currently on a text element. 4.2. After all, doesn't the frame fulfill all the requirements of Kantian beauty? For example, it is hard to imagine something more non-signifying, more meaningless than the silent frame. It is less meaningful, in the representational and propositional sense, than absolute music, which has proven itself quite susceptible to verbal description. It is much easier to coax a clear meaning from a piece of sound than from a piece of non-sound. Further, the frame is more a goal unto itself, a better example of Kantian free beauty than the work proper, which always needs an internal environment, whether that represented world is real as, with the picture, or, imagined as, with music. In music, as we have seen, that internal environment is a virtual world of another temporal quality, a world we could not access without the silence, of the frames. For a musical work to exist, the frame is necessary, perhaps more so than the music itself, which always requires a frame to make itself understood as music. Unlike the work itself, the frame stands alone, inasmuch as it must be understood as adhering permanently neither to itself nor to the work it both serves and makes possible. You are currently on a selectable text. 4.3. In conclusion, if all these things are true of the frame, then how might they bear pragmatically upon music analysis? In order to retain the fiction of the autonomous work of music, and all the sophisticated analytic machinery that has been manufactured to show just how beautiful that work is, must these functions of the frame, and not just that of silence, be ignored? It would seem impossible to formalize quantitatively the interactions of frame and work, yet the development of qualitative categories, in a much more detailed manner than has been possible here, might provide or at least suggest new ways of listening. At minimum, such a project should construct categories that account for the lack, within music that allow us to hear framing as both necessary and contingent at the same time. On the other hand, if all the above things are not true about the frame, if the frame somehow is not as beautiful as the music itself, in any of the ways outlined in the previous paragraph, then arguments of how the frame fails to attain beauty would interest me very much. You are currently on a text element.
We fucking did that. Shit. That was great. I'm happy about it. I really
Voiceover off.
appreciated reading Frank's post. It related to a lot of things I've been thinking about recently. More specifically, like, what is the frame of a data visualization? That's kind of how I know. That's how I'm familiar with Frank's work. I follow his poor calf principles from Chartability and kind of try to interrogate those and critique those. Nobody asked for that shit, but I do it anyway. Like, so Derrida came up in this, and in my book here, it's getting wet in this comic book about fucking Derrida, because I'm a grown ass adult who God, I'm such a dilettante. What I guess, like, if anybody ever gets to this point here, it's just like, yeah, I know a lot of what I know from comic books. I have collections of these. Chris Calloway introduced me to them. Miss that dude. Let's see. Let's look for painting here. Frame didn't come up. Par Ergon is on there. We talked about that. Okay, inside, outside. So there's this section here that starts with like Kant's aesthetics, and kind of again sort of that concept that the author brought up about how there's no real inside or outside here. So yeah, I really think about this work around the work, and where it belongs. And I think that that's where, like, so this is the part I really wanted to get to. I don't know how to pronounce this shit. If anybody knows how to say French stuff. The inside-outside opposition has always governed writing about art. What is inside art, therefore essential to art's identity, is what has been written about, and the writing will be outside. Derrida questioned this assumption. For instance, in 1990, he curated for the Louvre, Paris, an exhibition of drawings and paintings, memoirs of the blind. He treated the images as part ergonal, work around the work, as the permeable borders of his writing, It was a bid to bring attention to what is usually exterior and to set up passages across the inside, outside, essential, and inessential. And then he goes a little bit further and starts playing with the meaning of the word blind and gets to this idea that drawing and visual art originates from blindness. The object or model, even if facing the artist, cannot be seen at the moment that the mark is made. There's always a gap or a delay. The mark relies on memory, and when the memory is invoked, the object is ignored. The artist will be blind to it. Drawing like language is impossible without the play of the trace, the play of presence and absence, and this cannot be seen. So again, like omission is a really critical aspect of writing and art itself. So I guess like overall, it's like how do we? I really think that in order to get to this place where we're actually making accessible visualizations, we have to start from a place of blindness or from not seeing. And that's where we start from text. Like ultimately, for something to make it up to a screen reader, it's got to be text. And if we start from the visual, we're always trying to expand the perceptual channels that we're trying to communicate. But if we start from text, then we have the ability to communicate a lot of different modalities. But man, it was super inspiring being able to take some time and think a little bit about dataink and kind of finish this up here. It's some fun. I'll take a picture of it, share it along with this when I summarize it, a blog post. But super cool. Thanks to Frank for writing everything, and also thanks to oh boy, who's the gentleman that wrote this guy? Mr. Littlefield. This was in 1996. I really like semiotics. If you have a naming problem, pick up a semiotics comic book.